You gonna push it?
Yeah. All right. So this is podcast number 2 for American Indian philosophy on discussion
My
with
name is Ed.
3 questions. My name is Dan.
My
So
name is Dylan.
the first question is each of these week's readings and videos covers aspects of one or more of the topics of ecology, story, and the responsibility of place of humankind in the world, the broader web of life, and within the life cycle. How do these 3 topics connect across the readings and videos? So my answer to that one was that these 3 topics are connected across readings and videos through the common theme of native perspectives and knowledge of history, ecology, and culture. The significance of recognizing native indigenous existence before colonial powers were introduced and destroyed everything America once was is the main premise. As centuries later, ecology and environmental factors have degraded in both quality and quantity, it's through the stories natives have told that reveals it's the fault. It's the settlers' fault. So definitely I related this question mostly to Lila Jones' TED Talk. Hers was primarily like the actual practices and knowledge of indigenous groups rather than um Hal's reading, how it was mostly like, oh, this is how the pre-colonial like settlers came and they were like, oh, like how do we like manage this relationship between us? And then the natives came together, they set up I believe it was a confederacy, a native confederacy. And they were like, you know what, we're gonna tolerate, we're gonna educate, respect, and like educate each other at the same time. And in that way, it was the natives who like took care of the settlers, but then in that, how I had mentioned that it was, yeah, on page 4, she had said, ironically, unification would enable the colonizers to seize almost all of the homelands of the Indians because they set up that native confederacy. That was my answer for number 1.
Number 10. Okay.
Mhm.
All right, for number 1, I wrote the readings and videos theater of themes of equal law, story, and human responsibility to outline some important connections among nature, culture, and the ethic stance. Story gives us critical ecology knowledge showing interrelationships of all living beings and show the duty of existence respectfully with the environment. For instance, the one common aspects in most indigenous stories is that each story tells us about the outcome of human actions of ecosystem from nature, which arise from an overall feeling of obligation toward protecting and preserving nature.
Mhm. That was a good one. And then for answer number 2, what do each of these readings and videos have to say about the term story? How is the term story used in each one? Now, I pulled from the 3 examples of the 2 TED Talks and the How reading. I believe the other sources in the module was for the next assignment, so these are the only ones I have referenced. So I really liked Lila Jones' response in her TED Talk. It was a key component of not only practicing native knowledge, but giving the land back to the original caretakers. Her interpretation of story was of the science and practice indigenous peoples have used, and it was really intriguing listening to what she and mentioned that fossil fuel records showed that the Shawnee ancestors took care of the chestnut food forest for over 3,000 years straight. And I thought that was really cool because, like, how do you prove that? And, like, how do you know, like, it was, like, that abundant in fruit or nuts at that time? And then through this, she shared that the charcoal traces implied that they accomplished it by burning and prescribed burning the forest floor. And it's not really a utilized practice now. I mean, not prescribed burns. I feel like it's definitely within the past maybe like decade that they started implementing that again. But as she stated, like it enriches the soil, it helps soil retain water, eliminates other vegetation, thus it boosts the immune systems of the forest. and thus giving them more abundant fruit. And then they treated the land as if it was their living heirloom, you know, like for, I guess, Westerners, you would call it like an emblem or, you know, some actual tangible device or item. Whereas for them, like the living heirloom was the land. So they took care of this land intentionally to like pass on to further generations. And so not giving like the land back to the original takers would be not only simply appropriating, but mimicking, which I thought was very important in the sense that we are learning about this, but then we're not actually like, I guess, partaking in like native knowledge, like practice, well, not practicing native knowledge, but like we can be doing a little more, you know, in our areas, even like on a community.
Mhm.
And then Leon, Liana Leduc's TED Talk made the comparison of large companies exploiting fossil fuels to drug addiction. It makes sense in a theatrical view to help the audience use the connection much more clearly and was much more interactive with the audience too. Drug addiction is not only more like um significant in marginalized communities and exciting fossil fuels for the land extracting fossil fuels from the land of natives proves America's need for convenience. Her sense of story was to prove a point that we're taking resources for granted and wanting them for the sake of destroying the environment at that point. Because we know fossil fuels are bad and like
Yeah.
at that point, but she's like, oh, like we're wasting it. We're actually taking advantage of everything that's at this point. And she had mentioned fuel poverty. So like we got so greedy to the point that we are extracting fossil fuels from our own land because other resources are not giving us as much as we want, I think. I think that's what she was trying to indicate in her TED Talk. Um, and how exploiting our own fossil fuel means taking advantage of like different marginalized groups. For example, like going on reservations armed with the semi, I don't know, and with the full army, basically. Well, not full army, but like a whole a whole unit. And that we basically waste 50% of our energy. So what's the point and we're not even using. Then my third answer for number two is how describe story interchangeably, yet is a more history documenting sense in a more history documenting sense by describing what had occurred through native perspectives and reasons. And it's a truth that I've never heard before with how the natives like created a confederacy and how
Mhm.
they kind of managed and took care of the settlers. Well, I knew they took care of the settlers, but I don't know how they did it, you know? What's your answer?
All right, for number two, I, I watched the TED Talk from Red Deals, which is about how how they take away the how they take away native children and put them to boarding school. And for my answer, the story seems to be important to understanding and working together through historical trauma. It's centrally focused on how on the systematic oppression in which oppression against indigenous people say in the boarding school, like most of the children from natives were taken away from them and put them to boarding school. So like he just like talks about how they had trauma, how they feel abused and not able to see their parents again. And sometimes they like I'm not sure this is related to this or
Mm.
but if like a couple years ago I heard about a story that they found like bodies of children inside of a boarding school in Canada, which is like which is kind of like sad and messed up at the same time.
Yeah.
You also Red Deal points out the stories unveil relates of the living existence of indigenous identity and survival and serve as a powerful narrative of healing and reclamation. Deal's search established a fact valid that the narratives of the indigenous people have been suppressed and disgraced. Although the spread although the spread for horticultural survival, this has come to describe how the act of the storytelling in these people's communities, new creations can contest old colonial views, producing understanding and reclaiming identity based on the autocrat of representation and connected history to present life reflection of indigenous people.
Mhm.
That's what I wrote for number two.
That was a lot. So, especially with Greg Deal's video, it proves that we don't listen to like native stories a lot, or they're not revealed to us.
Yeah.
There's so much that we don't know, and especially with the children's boarding schools, like they were forced to assimilate, or else like it meant death, you know? And
Uh-huh.
if they were to assimilate to some point, it still wasn't enough for the white settlers or the white community that was next to the reservation or to wherever it was, no?
Hmm.
And even though there's a lot of untold stories from different marginalized groups, you know, from like the disabled community, like the Black community, or from the LGBT community, it can like it just proves that, you know, white people, or yeah, white people would do anything to like not have that perspective shown or revealed. Like, yeah, like they don't want to acknowledge that it once happened. You know how people always say like, oh, that happened in the past. Why are you like still talking about it? Like it's still
Yeah.
important. It's
It
still
still affects
happening.
us somehow
Yeah.
in a way.
Like there's still different boundaries that we still need to cross, or else like it's just gonna keep continuing, or maybe even get worse if we don't acknowledge or talk about it. So I'm glad he talked about it, especially. And then for number three, the concept of story is central to both American Indian studies and many Native North American cultures. Yet the Western definition of story is inaccurate, dismissive, and acts as an extension of colonial oppression. What does the term story mean in the American Indian studies sense of the word? And then hint, Western dictionaries will give you so many wrong answers. Go deeper in your research and how you read and view this week's materials and how you talk to each other. And then my answer to that was the term story in American Indian studies is utilized to make sense to indigenous communities. It's a term to describe, share, and educate others through, and can be referenced very loosely. Howe had not only mentioned this as it's an interchangeable term, but stated retellings are dependent on the storyteller and the audience. It's catered and meanings are shifted to fit a specific situation or paradigm. It's unique in the moment, or unique to the moment. And I think that specifically refers to Howe's description of story and how it relates to the actual like Native Confederacy at the time and like 1700s. But I also think the story was much more like significant in Lila Jones' TED Talk, because it was more like I'm gonna show you this how like native ecosystems were much taken care of by natives on native land, like without the white settlers involved. And then Brianna Leduc's TED Talk was discussing like mostly fossil fuels, you know, and how like it's degrading the environment and how it's environmentally like an injustice to the native community. I think that was nice. But they kind of all talk about it very loosely and like not like, oh, like this, they actually use the word story, you know?
Mm.
That's my answer.
All right, for number three, my answer is the American Studies, in American Indian Studies story conveys far more than the narrative from a familiar to a people in the Western culture. Story enables a thematic, historical way of knowing and understanding the world. Stories of vessel wisdom, cultural identity, and spiritual connection, which enable historical teachings, ethical lessons, and ecological knowledge. They hold communities together and themselves understood as of life. Interconnection experience that help create both personal and group identities. Group identities, whether it's Western definition of stories reduced to simple entertainment and indigenous story reflects the responsibility, ration, and the body of cultural values and human experiences that pay respect to humanity and nature overall.
That was good. Did you have a favorite like reading or TED talk that you had watched?
I mean, the only one that taught me was that Red Deals. That's the only one that I kind of like.
Like the most?
Yeah,
Yeah, I liked how he integrated his own personal life into it, like with his paintings. I
yeah,
feel
because that has more personal feelings, like
yeah.
more in depth.
I think another personal one would be Lila Jones TED Talk. You know, she didn't mention her son like Rihanna did, but it was more like a heart to heart kind of discussion through like environmental matters, whereas Leona was like talking to her audience like a casual conversation, which was nice. But I feel like for understanding the actual term of, well, I guess that also exemplifies like the term worldview because it can be used every way and like not in every single aspect either. And for how it was mostly like a documentation of history. I think with Greg's and Lila June's TED Talk, those were our favorite then, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that would be the end of this TED Talk. Well, podcast then. All right. Thank you for
Thank
listening.
you. Thanks for listening.
Ah, see you.